Hi everyone, welcome to Azad Revenge Stories channel. Right before I stepped out to attend my sister's supposed reconciliation brunch, my phone buzzed with a text from my lawyer. Don't go. 15 minutes later, I discovered her house held more than just coffee and fake apologies. A mobile notary, a crisis counselor, and a buyer were waiting to swallow my family legacy. She planned to erase my control in one afternoon, but she forgot that my true talent is catching fraud before the ink dries. My name is Aurora Evans. I was 38 years old, and on a damp, gray Sunday morning in Wilmington, I was about to step straight into my own downfall. My hand was already resting on the cool brass of my front door knob. I had spent the last 2 hours agonizing over what to wear to a reconciliation brunch. You want to look put together, but not defensive, soft, but not yielding. My sister, Greer Holt, had called it a peace offering. After 6 months of a slow-burning family Cold War following the trust handover, she had finally extended an olive branch, kitsch mimosas, and a chance to clear the air. Right as I pressed down on the latch, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. It was a sharp, vibrating rhythm that felt jarring against the quiet of the foyer. I pulled it out, expecting a text from Greer telling me to pick up ice or asking how far away I was. Instead, the screen displayed a message from Elias Ward, our family attorney and the man who had guided my parents through every legal hurdle for over 2 decades. Don't go. Lock the door. I'm coming. Elias was a man of measured words and immaculate composure. He did not use exclamation points. He did not use capital letters. Before I could even process the absurdity of the message, the phone lit up with his incoming call. I answered. My voice caught somewhere in my throat. Elias. Aura, he said, his voice dropping an octave lower than usual, tight and vibrating with an anxiety I had never heard from him before. Are you in your car? No, I am at the door. I am leaving right now. Take your hand off the door, he ordered. The sheer authority in his tone made me step back instinctively. Do not go to Greer's house. Lock your deadbolt. I am less than 20 minutes away. Elias, what is going on? We are supposed to be smoothing things over, she baped. Listen to me very carefully. Elias cut in, his breath sounding ragged against the receiver. Do not go anywhere near that house. If for any reason she comes to you before I arrive, do not let her in. Do not sign a single piece of paper. And if you have already had anything she sent over, any gift basket, any coffee, tell me right now. Do not eat or drink anything she offers you. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Are you insane? It is my sister. Lock the door. Aurora, I will be there in exactly 18 minutes. He hung up. The silence in my hallway suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. I turned the deadbolt. The sharp click echoed off the hardwood floors. For almost 20 minutes, I paced the length of my living room. Outside, the Wilmington sky broke open, and a steady freezing rain began to wash over the street. My mind raced through 100 different scenarios, each more chaotic than the last, but none of them prepared me for the reality walking up my driveway. When the knock finally came, it was frantic. I pulled open the door to find Elias. His trench coat was soaked, rain dripping from his graying hair onto his glasses, but he did not seem to notice. He was clutching a thick, expandable leather file folder against his chest like it was a shield. His face was pale, his jaw set hard. He looked like a man who had just watched a bomb timer tick down to 1 single second. Kitchen Island, he said, bypassing pleasantries and walking straight into the heart of my home. I followed him, watching in stunned silence as he threw his wet coat over a stool and unzipped the leather folder. He did not speak. He just began pulling out stacks of legal documents, slapping them down onto the marble counter with a violent, rhythmic precision. Look at this, he commanded, pointing a shaking finger at the first thick packet of paper. I leaned in. The header bore the seal of the state family court. It was a petition for the appointment of a temporary conservator. I blinked, trying to force the legal jargon to make sense to my panicked brain. The petitioner was Greer Holt. The respondent was me. I started to read the summary clauses aloud, my voice trembling. Petitioner alleges the respondent, Aurora Evans, has demonstrated severe mental instability, erratic behavior, reckless endangerment of familial assets, and diminishing cognitive capacity to manage the Evans Rowe Trust. I looked up at Elias, the air entirely knocked out of my lungs. She is trying to declare me incompetent. She is trying to put me in a conservatorship. Keep reading, Elias said grimly, tapping the second stack of papers. This one was not a court petition. It was a closing schedule, a transaction itinerary for the sale of the central commercial block of Evans Row, the very heart of our family's legacy. The property I had spent the last 3 years renovating and protecting. The date on the closing schedule was today. The time was 3:00 in the afternoon. Elias, what is this? I never approved a sale. I am the managing trustee. They cannot close without my signature. They do not need your signature if you are declared incapacitated. And Greer is appointed as emergency trustee, Elias explained, his voice razor sharp. He pulled out another document, a guest list he had somehow intercepted. That reconciliation brunch you were about to attend. It was not a brunch, Aurora. It was an ambush. A beautifully orchestrated soft glove firing squad. He pointed to the names on the list. Breer, Denny, that much you knew. But look who else is sitting in her living room right now waiting for you. A mobile notary public, a crisis management counselor, a representative from the commercial lender, and a private medical evaluator. I stared at the names, the black ink blurring as my heart hammered against my ribs. The sheer scale of the betrayal was staggering. If you had walked through those doors, Elias continued, they were going to sit you down. Bria was going to cry. She was going to tell you how worried she is about your mental health. The counselor would step in using every psychological trick in the book to make you feel cornered, confused, and exhausted. They would present you with a choice. Voluntarily sign over emergency power of attorney and take a much-needed rest at a private facility they have already selected, or face a brutally public court battle where they drag your name through the mud. The kitsch, the mimosers, the sudden desperate texts from Greer about wanting to see me, wanting to heal the rift. It was all a staging ground. They had built a psychological trap, lined it with familial guilt, and waited for me to step into it and hand over the keys to my own life. I closed my eyes. The image of my sister standing in her immaculate kitchen, setting out fine china while a notary checked his stamp in the dining room, flashed behind my eyelids. I expected to feel the hot, blinding rush of panic. I expected to break down, to cry, to ask how my own flesh and blood could do this to me. But as I'd opened my eyes and looked at the damning paperwork spread across my kitchen island, the panic evaporated. It was replaced by a sudden, breathtaking coldness. A glacial calm settled over my nerves, freezing the tears before they could even form. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a sibling rivalry spiraling out of control. This was a calculated, bloodless corporate heist. Greer was not acting out of anger. She was executing a strategy. She had weaponized the language of care and concern to orchestrate a legal kidnapping of my autonomy. I traced my fingers over the petition where she had signed her name, claiming I was broken. She wanted to erase my control, my assets, my reputation, and my voice, all in one rainy afternoon. She thought I would be the weak, accommodating younger sister who would crumble under an intervention. She had made one catastrophic miscalculation. All right, Elias, I said, my voice shockingly steady, devoid of any tremble. I looked up at my lawyer, meeting his frantic eyes with absolute zero. They want to play with paper. Let us see what happens when the ink bleeds. Elias did not give me time to process the sheer audacity of the ambush before his hands were moving again. He flipped open a thick manila folder, his fingers tracing the edge of a stack of documents bound by a heavy black clip. The sharp snap of the metal echoing against the marble countertop sounded like a lock clicking shut. These were not court petitions or external schedules. These were internal Evans Rowe Holdings documents printed on our company letterhead carrying an air of sterile authority. He slid the first page toward me. It was a set of board meeting minutes. The date at the top was listed as tomorrow. My eyes scanned the meticulously justified paragraphs. It recorded a unanimous resolution by the Trust Advisory Committee to step me down from my duties and appoint Greer Holt as the sole temporary administrator of the family trust. They had written the script for a meeting that had not even happened yet, complete with fabricated quotes expressing deep sorrow and reluctance from the board members. But the true venom was buried in the second exhibit. Elias tapped his pen against a specialized addendum tucked behind the fate minutes. His voice was completely devoid of its usual warmth, reduced to the flat clinical tone of a surgeon pointing out a malignant tumor. "Read the contingency clause," he instructed. I leaned closer. The legal phrasing was dense, designed to exhaust the reader, but the intent cut through the jargon like a razor. It stipulated that if I was deemed uncooperative, unresponsive, or exhibiting signs of cognitive and functional decline within a period of 72 hours following the initial intervention, Greer would be legally authorized to activate an emergency proxy. This proxy would grant her unilateral power of attorney over all core assets, bypassing the standard 30-day review period required by our father's original charter. The breath left my lungs in a slow, jagged exhale. This was never just about seizing control of a lucrative commercial block or a piece of prime real estate. Greer was not merely trying to steal a building. She was orchestrating a complete and total hostile takeover of my existence. The addendum was designed to strip me of my voting rights, freeze my access to the operational accounts, lock me out of the trust management software, and systematically dismantle my professional reputation. If I fought back, I was uncooperative. If I withdrew to protect myself, I was unresponsive. If I showed any normal human emotion at being betrayed by my own blood, I was exhibiting functional decline. The trap was perfectly circular. And then Elias showed me the evidence they planned to use to snap the jaws of that trap shut. He spread out a series of smaller files. These were not legal forms. They were intimate fragments of my personal life, weaponized and recontextualized. I stared at copies of invoices from my private therapist. I had seen her for grief counseling after our parents passed away. Greer had managed to obtain the billing records and attached a cover sheet labeling them as intensive post-crises stabilization sessions. Next to the bills was a pharmacy showing a prescription for standard sleep medication I had taken during the estate transition. In the margins, someone had highlighted the medication name and typed a sterile clinical note suggesting a pattern of dependency and substance abuse. There was a timeline beautifully formatted listing 4 separate occasions over the past 6 months where I had missed or rescheduled minor meetings. One was due to a severe migraine, another because of a flight delay. In Greer's dossier, these isolated, mundane events were stitched together under a bold heading that read, "Inability to maintain schedule and fulfill basic fiduciary obligations." But the most chilling part of the presentation was visual. Elias slid 4 glossy photographs across the island. I felt a wave of nausea as I looked at myself through the lens of my sister's narrative. The first photo was taken at our mother's funeral. I was standing near the town car, my face pale, eyes swollen, looking utterly hollowed out. The second was a candid shot from a charity fundraiser 2 months ago, catching me mid-blink, making me appear disoriented and confused in a crowded room. The third was a grainy image taken in the parking lot outside my office building late at night, showing me leaning against my steering wheel, exhausted after a 14-hour workday. Individually, they were just bad photos placed together, presented to a judge or a board of directors alongside a tragic story told by a weeping sister. They created a devastatingly convincing sequence of visible tragic decline. Greer was not just stealing my assets. She was actively writing a fictional tragedy with me as the broken protagonist. Then Elias reached the bottom of the folder, the final blow, the one that transformed this from a family dispute into a financial slaughter. He pulled out the closing packet for the impending sale to the commercial buyer. The sheer volume of the paperwork was intimidating, but Elias knew exactly where to look. He flipped to the schedule of assets and liabilities. "They are not just selling Evans Row," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Look at the collateral schedules. Aurora, look at the cross-default provisions." I read the itemized list. I vision swimming listed right alongside the commercial properties of the trust were assets that had absolutely nothing to do with our family inheritance. There was the deed to my private condominium. There were the account numbers for my personal business credit lines. And there, Buried in the fine print of a corporate guarantee was my majority stake and managing directorship at Gray Line Governance Group, the independent consulting firm I had built entirely on my own, separate from the family money. How is this possible? I demanded, my voice finally rising, cracking the enforced silence of the kitchen. I never signed a cross-collateralization agreement. My personal assets are filed from the trust. I made absolutely sure of that when I took over. Elias pointed to the signature lines on the guarantee documents. They were blank, waiting for a signature, but the preamble of the contract cited a series of overarching indemnification clauses that tied my personal solvency directly to the trust's performance under the emergency proxy. If Greer triggered the 72-hour uncooperative clause, she would gain the legal authority to sign these guarantees on my behalf as my temporary conservator. By the time the ink dried on the sale of Evans Row, my personal assets would be locked in as collateral for the buyer's financing. If the family trust defaulted on any of the aggressive post-sale warranties Greer was offering, the buyer would have the legal right to liquidate my condo, drain my business accounts, and seize my voting shares in Gray Line Governance Group to cover the damages. She would not just be selling the family legacy. She would be dragging my entire independent life down with it. I would lose my home. I would lose the company I built from the ground up. I would be left completely destitute and professionally ruined, entirely dependent on whatever meager allowance my sister, in her infinite mercy as my conservator, decided to grant me. I stepped back from the kitchen island, the marble suddenly feeling like ice against my fingertips. I looked at the sea of white paper, the blue legal covers, the yellow highlight marks, and the glossy photographs. This was a crime scene. It lacked yellow tape or chalk outlines, but it was a scene of unparalleled violence nonetheless. This meticulously assembled dossier was not the result of a sudden impulsive act of greed by a desperate sister. You do not gather private medical records, orchestrate paparazzi-style photography, and draft complex cross-collateralized financial guarantees on a whim. This required weeks, perhaps months of cold, calculating premeditation. This was a sophisticated, well-funded campaign of financial disenfranchisement. Every document was a paper cut, precisely placed to bleed me out without leaving a mess on the floor. Greer had looked at me across dinner tables, hugged me at family gatherings, and sent me heart emojis while quietly building a guillotine in her home office. She had used the sacred language of mental health awareness and family duty to construct a floorless, impenetrable cage. She knew exactly how the system worked. She knew that courts err on the side of caution when presented with allegations of mental instability. She knew that the burden of proof would fall entirely on me to prove my own sanity, while all my resources to fight back were legally frozen. I looked at Elias. The panic that had gripped him earlier was gone, replaced by the grim hollow stare of a lawyer who knows his client is standing on a landmine. She thought of everything. He said quietly, "It is airtight. If you had walked into that house today and reacted with anger, you would have validated the instability claim. If you had cried, you would have shown weakness. It was a zero-sum game." I stared down at the photograph of myself, looking exhausted in the parking lot. The coldness inside me crystallized, hardening into something sharp and absolute. Greer had designed a perfect legal weapon to berate me, but in her arrogance, she had made a fatal error. She had assumed I would play the part she wrote for me. She assumed I would be the victim. She assumed wrong. The silence in my kitchen stretched out, broken only by the steady drum of rain against the window panes. The initial visceral shock of the paper ambush was receding, leaving behind a terrifyingly clear panoramic view of the past 6 months. It felt exactly like standing barefoot in a room full of shattered glass, finally realizing that the vase had not simply fallen off the table by accident. Someone had deliberately thrown it, aiming right at my feet. I closed my eyes, letting my mind drift backward. Isolated incidents that I had previously brushed off as the chaotic byproduct of a demanding career and personal grief suddenly snapped into a rigid, terrifying alignment. I thought about a Tuesday morning 3 months ago. It was the quarterly investor briefing for the downtown development project. I had walked into the boardroom exactly 60 minutes late. I vividly remembered standing in the lobby, staring at the calendar application on my phone in total bewilderment. The digital block had clearly shown a 10:00 start time, but the email chain they pulled up on the projector proved it had always been scheduled for 9 in the morning. I had apologized profusely to a room full of unamused faces, blaming a synchronization error on my devices, feeling a hot flush of deep embarrassment. I had looked foolish, disorganized, unstable. Then there was the vendor agreement for the commercial plumbing overhaul at the end of the summer season. A courier had dropped off a rush envelope. I had reviewed the terms, signed the final page, and sent it back, only to receive a frantic call the next morning from the site manager. I had been sent an outdated, heavily floored draft of the contract, one that would have cost the estate hundreds of thousands of dollars in liability if the manager had not caught it. I had assumed it was an administrative mix-up at the front office. I had blamed my own tired eyes. And just 4 weeks ago, on the morning of a critical city zoning board hearing, the private luxury car service I had booked weeks in advance to take me to the municipal building had been dispatched to an address 3 miles away from my townhouse. I had to hail a street cab in the pouring rain, arriving disheveled, soaking wet, and breathless. My opening arguments completely scattered. At the time, I had cursed my own bad luck. I had chided myself for losing my sharp age. Now, staring at the perfectly bound dossier of my supposed mental decline resting on the marble counter, I saw those moments for what they truly were. They were not random accidents or technical glitches. They were deliberate stress tests. They were carefully orchestrated acts of sabotage designed to manufacture a verifiable, documented history of incompetence. But the logistical sabotage was only half the architecture of this betrayal. The other half was the narrative she had spun around it. My thoughts drifted to the Botanical Garden charity gala just 2 months prior. It was my first major public appearance since finalizing the massive estate taxes following our parents' passing. I had felt fine that evening. I had worn a dark emerald gown, engaged in polite, lucid conversation with the city council members, and sipped sparkling water. But Greer had shadowed me the entire night, a constant, hovering presence, in the incredibly deafening, heavy silence of my permanent self-imposed exile. There was only one single person who absolutely refused to twist my sudden, unannounced absence into a malicious, unforgivable sin. Greer had stepped right into my personal space, her hand gripping my forearm with an uncomfortable, desperate tightness. Her voice, usually perfectly modulated for high society discretion, had been deliberately projected to carry across the room. "Are you absolutely sure you are okay to be out tonight?" she had asked, her tone dripping with a heavy theatrical concern. "You look so drained. You really do not have to push yourself for us." I had brushed her off, annoyed, but assuming she was just being her usual overbearing self. But then she had pulled me into a deep, clinging embrace. I had stood there stiffly as she patted my back, resting her chin heavily on my shoulder. To me, it had felt suffocating and unnecessary, but to anyone watching from the perimeter of the ballroom it painted a very specific, devastating picture. It looked exactly like a tragic, exhausted older sister valiantly trying to hold together a fragile, crumbling sibling who was entirely out of her depth. Greer had not chosen the path of direct confrontation. She had not screamed at me in boardrooms or sent threatening legal letters demanding control. She had chosen a far more insidious and legally effective tactic. She had cast herself in the role of the long-suffering martyr. Desperately trying to save me from my own deteriorating mind, Elias handed me another set of printouts, pulling my focus back to the present reality of the kitchen island. These were printouts of digital correspondence. "Look at the recipient lists," he instructed, his voice grave and low. I scanned the headers. The emails were sent directly from Greer's personal account. They were addressed to the chairwoman of the Botanical Society, 3 prominent members of my neighborhood homeowners association, and 2 local society columnists who practically dictated the social currency of Wilmington. The subject lines were all variations of the exact same theme: checking in, a quiet favor, keeping our family in your thoughts. The bodies of the emails were absolute masterpieces of subtle character assassination. Greer never stated outright that I was losing my mind or deemed incompetent. Instead, she used soft, damning language. She wrote eloquently about a private crisis. She mentioned how deeply our family was struggling behind closed doors to support my invisible battles. She explicitly asked for grace and understanding if I seemed detached, unreliable, or prone to sudden irrational mood swings. She had planted a massive garden of doubt all over the city, watering it meticulously with fake tears and sisterly devotion. The sheer perfection of the trap left me breathless with a terrifying kind of awe. Greer had built a reality where any natural human response I had would only seal my own fate. If I discovered her lies and confronted her with justified screaming rage, my raised voice and aggressive posture would be immediately weaponized. She would shrink back in mock terror and tell the board of directors to look at how volatile I had become. If I tried to passionately defend my sanity, the sheer desperation in my voice would be twisted into clinical paranoia. Every single act of self-defense would immediately mutate into fresh, undeniable evidence for the tragic story she had already sold to the entire world. My eyes dropped back down to the collection of witness affidavit Elias had pulled from the court filing. These were supposed to be independent sworn statements from various people confirming my erratic behavior to the judge. There was a statement from a former assistant, a vague account from an elderly neighbor, and a declaration from a contractor who claimed I had given him bizarre, contradictory instructions on a job site. I reached out and pulled the three thick affidavits side by side on the counter. I stared at the dense paragraphs of legalese, trying to find the individual voices of the people who had supposedly written them. Elias leaned heavily over my shoulder, following my gaze. "Do you notice anything strange about the formatting?" he asked softly. I squinted at the crisp pages. At first glance, they looked like standard legal filings from a respectable firm. But as I looked closer, the subtle anomalies began to leap off the white paper. "Look at the left margin on page 2 of every single statement," I whispered, tracing my index finger down the edge of the paper. "Exactly," Elias confirmed, tapping the desk. "The left margin indent jumps inward by exactly 12 on the second page of all 3 documents. That is not a standard word processor default setting. That is a highly specific formatting glitch." I looked closer at the header artifacts. At the very top edge of each page, there was a faint, almost microscopic gray line, slightly jagged on the right side. It was a digital scanner mark, a piece of dust or a microscopic scratch on the glass of a scanning bed that had transferred to the digital copy. The exact same unique dust mark was present on the contractor's statement, the neighbor's statement, and the assisted statement. They were all scanned on the identical machine, I said, the realization hardening my voice into a flat monotone. Elias nodded, turning to the last page of the packet where the metadata summary from the electronic court filing system was printed out in stark black and white. "Now look at the digital timestamps, the creation date, and the final edit time for all 3 supposedly independent documents." I read the numbers written out on the summary page. They were all created on the 12th of October, and the final edit times were logged consecutively at 9:14, 9:16, and 9:19 in the evening. "These people did not sit down and write these statements," I said, feeling a cold, humorless smile touch the corners of my mouth. "They did not independently decide to document my behavior and seek out my sister out of the goodness of their hearts. Greer wrote them, or someone working directly for her wrote them. They drafted the entire chorus of public concern on the exact same computer in the exact same hour, formatted them with the exact same glitch, printed them out, forced or paid these people to sign them, and scanned them back in on the exact same home office device. They had manufactured an illusion of consensus. They had built an angry, concerned crowd out of thin air to point their fingers at me." I stacked the affidavit back into a neat, perfect pile. The slight trembling in my hands, a remnant of the initial shock, had completely vanished. It was replaced by a terrifying, absolute stillness. The broken glass of the past 6 months was fully swept up, the picture completely, flawlessly restored. I was not dealing with a simple sibling dispute over money. I was not the victim of a sudden emotional betrayal born out of jealousy or petty short-sighted greed. I was standing dead in the crosshairs of a deeply methodical patient predator. Greer had taken the most sacred elements of family life, the protective embrace, the concerned inquiry, the gentle guidance, and she had dragged them through the mud to forge a weapon. I was facing someone who had taken gentleness and turned it into a scalpel, slowly and precisely cutting away my credibility, my assets, and my freedom, all while smiling directly in my face. I pulled my heavy laptop from my leather briefcase and set it down hard on the marble island next to the terrifying stacks of legal papers. The physical documents were horrifying, but they were just the final printed products. I needed to see the source. The kitchen was completely silent except for the relentless drumming of the rain against the glass doors. Elias stood silently behind me as the screen flared to life, casting a cold blue glow over his grim features. I bypassed the standard user interfaces and went straight for the deep administrative console of my primary email and secure cloud storage. I ignored the superficial inbox and dug directly into the raw account history, the recovery rights, and the core login. My eyes scanned the granular security dashboard, moving rapidly down the list of verified devices. I navigated to the two-factor authentication settings. My heart hammered a slow, painful rhythm against my ribs. My primary cellular number was listed correctly, but right beneath it, the backup recovery number, the safety net designed to bypass my phone if it was ever lost or stolen, ended in a sequence of digits I had never seen before in my life. I checked the exact timestamp of the modification. The number had been changed exactly 5 months and 14 days ago. It happened right around the very week Greer had started dropping by my office unannounced, acting overly concerned about my workload and my sleep schedule. They had built a silent back door. They possessed an invisible key to my entire digital existence, and I had been leaving the door wide open for nearly half a year. I opened my corporate calendar, the central nervous system of my daily operations. I pulled up the version history, an obscure administrative feature that most standard users never bother to check. The sheer scale of the manipulation was breathtaking. It was not just the major investor meeting I had missed last month. There were dozens of microscopic surgical alterations. A critical appointment with a city planner shifted forward by exactly 60 minutes. A digital reminder for a quarterly tax filing completely deleted and then quietly restored 2 days after the deadline had passed. My secure digital signature, the encrypted cryptographic seal I used to authorize large wire transfers and binding legal agreements, showed active access timestamps at 3:00 in the morning on a Sunday, a time I was definitively asleep in my own bed. They had not vandalized my professional life with a sledgehammer. They had used a scalpel. They made changes small enough to slip under my immediate radar, but significant enough to make me constantly doubt my own memory and competence. When I showed up late to the boardroom, I blamed my own exhaustion. When a drafted email disappeared from my outbox, I assumed my grief was finally catching up to my cognitive abilities. They were not merely trying to steal my family money. They were actively trying to drive me insane. They wanted me to feel like I was losing my absolute grip on reality, ensuring that when Greer finally sprung her trap, I might actually be broken enough to believe her lies. My fingers flew across the keyboard, driven by a cold and mechanical fury. I accessed the secure cloud directory where I kept my personal health and financial records. I located the folder containing the billing invoices from my private grief counselor. The files themselves were authentic, but the hidden metadata told a vastly different story. Someone had accessed the folder, downloaded the original portable document files, and then uploaded replaced versions. Before the replacement, they had deliberately renamed the files. An invoice originally titled General Wellness Support Session was now ominously labeled Behavioral Instability Treatment Protocol. They had executed this change weeks before printing the documents out for the court dossier. They were actively seeding my own cloud storage with poison, preparing the ground just in case a judge ever demanded a forensic audit of my hard drives. The digital evidence would perfectly corroborate their fabricated narrative. The sickness in my stomach deepened into a heavy dread as I moved my investigation from my personal life to my independent business. I logged into the secured payroll and vendor management portal for Gray Line Governance Group. This firm was my absolute sanctuary. It was the company I had built entirely with my own hands, completely separate from the immense shadow of the Evans Rowe legacy. I pulled up the upcoming quarterly disbursement schedule for the executive team. There, buried deeply in the middle of standard contractor payments and tax withholdings, was an active pending request to divert 50% of my personal managing director salary draw. The destination routing number belonged to a newly created corporate entity called Blue Aster Consulting. I had never heard of this firm. I had never opened an account under that name, but the banking details were fully verified and the authorization form carried a floorless digital copy of my cryptographic signature. If that scheduled payment went through at the end of the month, it would look exactly like I was actively embezzling funds from my own firm to hide money in a shell company. It was the perfect setup for a severe corporate malfeasance charge, giving Greer even more lethal ammunition to prove to the board that I was reckless, corrupt, and entirely unfit to manage any assets whatsoever. "I need to know exactly where they are doing this from," I said to Elias. My voice sounded like it belonged to a completely different woman. It was flat, totally devoid of panic, and vibrating with a lethal kind of focus. Elias leaned over the marble counter, pointing a steady finger at the illuminated screen. "Poll the Internet, protocol access logs for the past 90 days. Filter the results exclusively by unrecognized devices." I executed the query. A long, damning list of alphanumeric strings cascaded down the monitor. I traced the geographic locations of the Internet service providers. The vast majority of the malicious login did not originate from a dark web server located in a foreign country. They originated right here within the city limits of Wilmington. Specifically, the addresses mapped directly back to a secondary broadband residential node registered to my sister's home address. They were executing this entire operation from the guest network inside Greer's house. But as I stared intently at the execution trails, the complex command line inputs, and the sophisticated manner in which the digital tracks were routinely scrubbed, a chilling realization washed over me. Greer was cunning, and her husband Danny was deeply desperate, but neither of them possessed this specific level of high-tier technical literacy. They could barely reset their own home router without calling a service technician. The person silently navigating my system knew exactly how to evade standard enterprise security flags. They knew how to spoof authentication tokens perfectly. The technical execution bore the distinct, undeniable fingerprint of a seasoned cybersecurity professional. I delved deeper into the core security certificate registries, hunting for the ghost hiding inside my machine. I searched for the legacy administrator privileges, the foundational root codes that were established when I first migrated the massive family trust to a secure digital infrastructure 3 years ago. A single name popped onto the screen. It sat there blaring at me in stark white font against the dark interface, sucking all the remaining air out of the kitchen. Miles Corbett. My breath caught sharply in my throat. The kitchen seemed to suddenly tilt on its axis. Miles was not a random corporate hacker. He was my former fiancé. He was also the current chief executive officer of Corbett Shield Solutions, a highly exclusive boutique cyber security firm that catered specifically to high-net-worth individuals in our state. The memories hit me with the force of a physical blow. When our parents passed away in that horrific winter highway accident, my entire world had completely shattered. I was entirely consumed by a blinding grief, barely able to function on a daily basis, let alone manage the sudden and terrifying weight of the entire Evans Row Trust. Miles had been my absolute rock during those dark, suffocating months. He had held me together while I cried until dawn, and he had gently, protectively offered to handle the overwhelming logistics of securing the estate's vulnerable digital assets. I had handed him the master keys to my entire digital existence without a single second thought. I had trusted him implicitly with my life. Our relationship had slowly fallen apart a year later, dissolving under the immense, crushing pressure of my new corporate responsibilities and his own aggressively growing ambition. It was a deeply painful breakup, but I had genuinely believed it was amicable. I had assumed in my naive and grieving state that he had professionally relinquished his core administrative access when we separated our lives. He had not. He had kept a silent back door wide open, and now he was utilizing his intimate, granular knowledge of my life, my daily habits, and my system architecture to help my own sister destroy me. I pushed the silver laptop slightly away from me. The bright screen illuminated the dark marble of the kitchen island, casting long shadows across the room. Elias watched me closely, his face a mask of grim understanding. "He knows your infrastructure better than you do," Elias said quietly. "He built it," I replied, the words tasting exactly like bitter ash in my mouth. This was the final missing piece of the puzzle. This was the massive revelation that elevated Greer's twisted plan from a simple, greedy property grab to a terrifying, fully realized family coup. She had not just hired an anonymous criminal. She had actively recruited the one man who knew exactly where all my digital bodies were buried, the man who had laid the very foundation of my personal security. Together, they had weaponized my painful past against my present reality. They had entirely rewritten my digital history, manipulated my daily schedule to make me look hopelessly incompetent, planted false evidence, and set up a financial tripwire that would permanently ruin my independent career. They did not need me to die to get what they wanted. They simply needed me to be legally and socially erased from the board. They had turned my own memories, my own business, and my own calendar into an invisible, airtight prison. And they had done it all while patting my arm, smiling softly, and asking if I was feeling okay. Elias did not stop at the digital intrusion. He pivoted seamlessly into the financial undercurrents that had to be driving a conspiracy of this immense magnitude. He opened a secure portal connected to his private forensic accounting network, his eyes scanning the encrypted ledgers he had pulled from the shell companies orbiting my sister's life. "Follow the money," he murmured, his fingers dancing across the keys. "People do not orchestrate a family coup just for hypothetical future gains. They do it because they are actively bleeding right now." Within minutes, the bleeding became visible on the screen. Elias brought up a wire transfer log that made the air in the kitchen feel instantly heavier. A commercial real estate development group named Briar Point Development had authorized a massive non-refundable hard advance. The sum was staggering. It was exactly $600,000. The money had bypassed the standard corporate escrow accounts entirely and was deposited directly into a private joint checking account held by Greer and her husband D.N.E. Hall. This was not a standard earnest money deposit. This was a bribe disguised as a good faith advance contingent on a firm promise to deliver the Evans Row property quickly, quietly, and completely devoid of my interference. But the $600,000 had not remained in that joint account for more than 48 hours. Elias traced the outgoing wires, watching the fortune shatter into desperate, frantic pieces. A massive chunk had been instantly swallowed by the catastrophic collapse of D&E's vanity restaurant project downtown, a culinary disaster that had been hemorrhaging cash for the better part of a year. Another massive wire had gone directly to a premium credit card issuer, wiping out an astronomical balance on Greer's exclusive black card. The rest was funneled toward two rapidly maturing personal loan obligations that carried brutal penalty clauses. My sister and brother-in-law were not just living slightly beyond their means. They were drowning in a spectacular, suffocating ocean of toxic debt. "Why the sudden rush?" I asked, staring at the depleted account balances on the monitor. "Why risk this insane ambush today? Why not slowly chip away at me over the next year?" Elias pulled up the municipal calendar on his tablet, sliding it across the marble counter because of the City Planning Commission. "There is a decisive zoning vote happening on Thursday morning regarding the historical commercial district surrounding Evans Row." The realization hit me like a physical blow. If that zoning vote passed, implementing stricter historical preservation guidelines, the commercial redevelopment value of our property would plummet by tens of millions of dollars. Briarpoint wanted to bulldoze the legacy structures and build high-density luxury condominiums. They needed to close the acquisition and file their demolition permits before the city locked the entire district down. If Greer did not deliver my signature or her own signature as my legal proxy by the end of the day, the Briarpoint deal would completely evaporate. And without that deal, her creditors would tear her and D&E apart by Friday afternoon. This was not a calculated game of chess. It was a chaotic, desperate scramble for a financial lifeline, and I was the heavy anchor they needed to cut loose in order to survive. But the true depths of Greer's desperation had birthed a monstrous logistical plan. As I continued to dig through the intercepted emails Elias had compiled, a newly decrypted attachment caught my eye. It was an itinerary from a boutique crisis management firm, a company specializing in discreet recovery support for high-profile individuals. I opened the file, my blood running completely cold. It was a transportation and intake schedule booked entirely under my name. If I had walked into that brunch, if they had successfully cornered me and forced my signature under the guise of an emergency intervention, the nightmare would not have ended in that dining room. The itinerary detailed a private medical transport vehicle scheduled to idle just 2 blocks away from Greer's house. Following the signing, I was to be immediately escorted into that van and driven to an exclusive out-of-state wellness retreat located deep in the mountains of a neighboring jurisdiction. The booking was for a mandatory 14-day stabilization period. It was totally incommunicado, no phones, no internet access, and absolutely no outside contact allowed. She did not just want to steal my legal authority. She intended to physically disappear me from the playing field. She needed me locked in a padded velvet cage for the first 2 weeks. That was the exact window she required to finalize the Briar Point sale, change all the corporate locks, empty the operational accounts, and stand in front of the local press, dabbing her eyes with a tissue while announcing that her beloved sister had suffered a tragic mental break and required absolute privacy. By the time I could legally discharge myself and find a telephone, the Evans Row legacy would be a construction zone, and my independent life would be liquidated to cover her collateral damage. She has already started laying the groundwork at the corporate level, Elias said, interrupting my horrifying realization. He showed me a chain of encrypted text messages exchanged between Greer and 2 of the oldest, most conservative members of the Evans Row Holdings Board of Directors. The messages were dripping with manufactured sorrow. Greer had quietly informed them over evening cocktails that I was buckling under the severe pressure of the estate management and would be taking an indefinite immediate health leave. She had poisoned the well at the very top of my professional pyramid. She was actively ensuring that when I vanished into that mountain facility, the board would not raise a single red flag. They would simply sigh, praise Greer for stepping up during a family tragedy, and blindly rubber stamp her proxy authority. I stood absolutely still in the center of my kitchen, the sheer gravity of the conspiracy anchoring my feet to the hardwood floor. For months I had agonized over the growing distance between Greer and me. I had lost sleep, wondering if I was failing her, failing our parents' memory by not keeping the family united. Now, staring at the blueprints of my own execution, the emotional fog completely lifted. Greer did not hate me. Hatred is passionate and irrational. This was entirely transactional. She and Deanie had built a towering house of cards out of vanity and terrible investments, and the wind was finally howling at their front door. They looked at me, at my stability, at the legacy I was carefully protecting, and they saw nothing but a massive pile of uncashed chips. They were perfectly willing to sell my entire future, my freedom, and my sanity just to pay off their own outstanding debts. A sudden, sharp urge to fight surged through my veins. I wanted to march over to her house right now. I wanted to kick the front door open, throw these printed documents onto her expensive dining table, and watch the color drain from her face. I wanted to scream until my lungs burned, to tear down the entire facade in front of her fake crisis counselor and her bought and paid for notary public. But I forced the fire down, burying it deep beneath a layer of absolute freezing logic. If I attacked now, the ambush would fail, but the war would drag on indefinitely. She would retreat, deny everything, claim the documents were merely drafts or misunderstandings, and immediately begin plotting a new, quieter way to destroy me. She would instantly play the victim, claiming my aggressive confrontation was definitive proof of my emotional instability. I looked at Elias. The panic had completely left his eyes, replaced by the sharp assessing gaze of a veteran litigator watching his client evolve from a target into a strategist. "We are not filing an injunction," I stated, my voice echoing off the marble surfaces, cold and utterly decisive. Elias raised an eyebrow. "If we do not file an injunction to block the temporary conservatorship petition, she might actually find a judge willing to sign it before the end of the day." "Let her try," I replied, staring at the screen. Let her think the trap is springing exactly as she designed it. Let her believe she has successfully neutralized me. Desperate, greedy people only drop their guard when they firmly believe they have already crossed the finish line. We are going to let her run the entire race. We are going to let her reach for the prize. I closed the laptop monitor with a sharp, definitive click. The battle lines were perfectly drawn, illuminated by the harsh light of undeniable financial desperation. My sister wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate and psychological warfare. She wanted to gamble with my life to save her own. I was going to let her place all her borrowed chips on the table, and then I was going to ensure she lost absolutely everything she had ever valued. It was approaching midnight, and the adrenaline that had fueled my afternoon strategy session with Elias had completely burned off, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. The storm outside had not relented, the rain driving hard against the glass panes of my living room. I was sitting in the dark, staring at the shadows cast by the street lights when a sudden sharp rapping sound broke the silence. It came from the back patio door. I froze, my pulse instantly hammering in my throat. I moved silently across the room and peered through the security blinds. Standing on my wet terrace, shivering violently under the dim yellow glow of the security light, was my niece, Tessa Hall. She was 26 years old, in her second year of law school, and currently working as a legal intern at a prestigious downtown firm. Her trench coat was soaked through, her dark hair plastered to her cheeks, and her eyes carried the heavy, haunted look of someone who had just watched a terrible accident unfold and could not look away. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy glass door open, pulling her inside out of the freezing wind. I immediately moved toward the hall closet to grab a dry towel, but her voice, sharp and trembling, stopped me in my tracks. "Do not try to comfort me, Aunt Aurora," she said, her arms wrapped tightly around her own torso. "I do not deserve a warm towel, and I am certainly not here to ask for your forgiveness on behalf of my mother." I turned back to face her. She stood in the center of my kitchen, her eyes darting to the marble island where Elias and I had spread out the damning legal documents just hours before. She knew exactly what had happened today. The absolute certainty in her gaze confirmed it. I stepped closer, keeping my voice low and steady. "Why are you here, Tessa? It is the middle of the night." "Because I cannot breathe in that house anymore," she whispered, her voice cracking before she forced it back into a rigid clinical tone. "I cannot sit at that dining table and listen to them refer to this horrific, illegal scheme as a necessary family solution. They keep repeating that phrase over and over, as if saying it enough times will somehow sanitize the fact that they are trying to destroy you." Tessa took a deep, shuddering breath, her legal training fighting against her profound emotional disgust. She confessed everything, the words spilling out in a desperate rush. She told me how her mother had systematically leveraged Tessa's own professional credentials. 2 nights ago, Greer had called Tessa into the home office, placed a stack of trust addendums in front of her, and explicitly ordered her to sign the pages as an official witness. The dates on those documents were rolled back by 4 months, Tessa explained, tears finally mixing with the rainwater on her face. When I told her it was a fraudulent execution, she looked at me with this terrifyingly blank expression. She told me to stop acting like a naive law student and do my part to save the family from your mental collapse. She forced me to forward confidential internal emails from the holding company server, and she explicitly commanded me to remain entirely silent about the true guest list for the brunch this morning. She made me an accomplice to a felony before I have even taken my bar exam. I felt a fresh wave of nausea twist my stomach. Greer was not just willing to sacrifice me. She was perfectly willing to risk her own daughter's entire legal career, her future, and her freedom just to ensure her desperate financial coup succeeded. But Tessa had not braved a midnight storm just to confess her forced sins. She reached deep into the pocket of her soaked coat and pulled out a heavy dark smartphone. "My father is arrogant and careless," Tessa said, her grip tightening around the device. "He leaves his secondary backup phone unlocked in his study. He thinks I am just a compliant child who does not understand digital security. I took it 2 hours ago. You need to hear exactly What is on this device? She tapped the screen, navigating to a hidden folder of voice memos and intercepted audio files. She pressed play on the first recording and set the phone down on the cold marble. The audio was slightly muffled, likely recorded covertly during a heated argument. But the aristocratic, perfectly modulated voice of my sister was unmistakable. Hearing her speak when she thought I was not listening was infinitely more terrifying than reading her legal petitions. We just need to get her under strict medical observation for 72 hours. Greer's recorded voice stated, cold and sharp as a butcher's knife, that is the entire window. Once she is officially checked into the out-of-state facility and heavily sedated for evaluation, her physical signature becomes legally irrelevant. I can instantly execute the emergency proxy, authorize the transfer of the trust control, secure the company voting rights, and drain her personal credit lines before she even wakes up enough to realize the door is locked from the outside. The recording clicked off. The sheer casual cruelty of it. The way my sister discussed stripping me of my civil rights and locking me away as if she were planning a minor kitchen renovation left me entirely speechless. But Tesser was not finished. She selected a second audio file. "Listen to this one," she commanded, her voice dropping to a disgusted whisper. "This is your former fiancé." The second the audio began, my blood turned to ice water. It was Miles. He was speaking to Greer, his tone dripping with a smug, self-congratulatory arrogance that made my skin crawl. "You do not need to worry about her looking coherent to the judge." Greer. Miles chuckled on the recording. "I have already built the entire behavioral profile from the ground up. I pulled the raw data streams from her smart doorbell camera, her security entry logs, and her internal home network devices. I can show the court exactly when she paces the floor at 3 in the morning. I scrambled the synchronization on her editing and calendar applications to guarantee she misses those crucial appointments. I made the raw data tell a flawless, undeniable story of severe cognitive decline. The digital footprint proves she is completely losing her grip on reality. They will never question the intervention." I stared blindly at the black screen of the phone. The violation was absolute. Miles had not just hacked my passwords. He had turned my own home into a surveillance state. Every time I had walked to the kitchen for water in the middle of the night, every time I had struggled with insomnia, he had been watching, logging the data, and packaging my private moments of grief into a weaponized dossier of insanity. Tesser picked up the phone, swiped the screen, and handed it directly to me. "Look at the photograph. I took this right before you were supposed to arrive this morning." I looked at the glowing image. It was a high-resolution photograph of Greer's formal dining room. The heavy antique mahogany table was draped in a beautiful, delicate floral tablecloth, exactly what one would expect for a Sunday family brunch. But resting on top of the fine linen next to the crystal glasses were not menus or name tags for family members. They were precise printed plates indicating professional roles. I read the bold black ink. The mobile notary, the commercial bank representative, the media consultant, the crisis evaluator. It was a horrific juxtaposition. It was not a dining room waiting for a reconciliation. It was a miniature private courtroom meticulously staged and camouflaged by floral patterns and baked goods designed to prosecute me, without a judge, without a jury, and without any defense attorney present. I slowly handed the phone back to my niece. The silence in the kitchen was profound, the air heavy with the weight of shattered illusions. From that exact moment, the fundamental nature of my war completely shifted. Looking at Tesser, standing there dripping wet and shaking with moral outrage, I realized this was no longer a simple defensive maneuver to protect my bank accounts, my real estate holdings, or my professional titles. Greer was not just a greedy sibling making a desperate grab for cash. She was the architect of a deeply toxic sociopathic system. She was actively poisoning the next generation of our family, forcing her own bright, ethical daughter to validate a fabricated reality through emotional blackmail. She was weaponizing the very concept of kinship, twisting familial trust, maternal authority, and romantic history into blunt instruments of absolute coercion. I reached out and placed my hand firmly on Tesser's trembling shoulder. I did not offer her a meaningless platitude or tell her everything would be fine. I offered her a promise. They think they have built the perfect trap, I said, my voice resonating with a dangerous newfound clarity. They think they have written a script that cannot be altered, but they handed the pen to the wrong person. Tesser, we are not just going to stop the sale. We are going to burn their entire stage to the ground. The early hours of Monday morning found Elias and me surrounded by mountains of archival boxes. After sending my niece home with strict instructions to act exactly as she normally would, my lawyer and I had relocated to the secure basement study of my townhouse. We hauled out the original leather-bound operating agreements for Evans Row Holdings and the foundational trust documents my parents had drafted over 2 decades ago. Understanding a trap is only the first step of survival. Dismantling it immediately is the instinct of a frightened prey. I was not prey. I did not want to merely break the snare my sister had set for me. I wanted to construct a massive, inescapable vault around her while she was still holding the trigger. We combed through thousands of pages of dense legalese, hunting for a structural weakness in Greer's hostile takeover strategy. My parents had been extraordinarily shrewd developers who understood that wealth could easily fracture a family. Around 3:00 in the morning, under the harsh glare of a brass desk lamp, Elias found the exact armor we needed. He slid a yellow typewritten addendum across the mahogany desk. It contained 2 incredibly specific, highly punitive defense mechanisms buried deep within the bylaws. The first was a strict anti-inheritance fraud provision. It explicitly stated that if any beneficiary of the estate deliberately submitted fabricated medical, psychological, or legal documentation regarding the capacity of another beneficiary, the offending party would immediately and automatically forfeit their right to all discretionary financial distributions. It was a self-destruct button for greed. If Greer formerly submitted those fake therapy invoices and forged witness statements to a judge or the board, she would not just fail to take my share, she would legally sever her own access to the family wealth. The second mechanism was a purely commercial fail-safe designed to protect the legacy of the property itself. The operating agreement mandated a strict 30-day advance notification period for the traditional market cooperative and the 3 core anchor tenants before any sale of the central plaza could be legally finalized. Furthermore, those tenants held an ironclad right of first refusal. I stared at the clause, a cold, predatory satisfaction settling in my chest. Greer and her desperate husband were attempting to close the sale with Briar Point Development in a matter of hours. They needed that cash injection immediately to save themselves from their own catastrophic debts. They absolutely did not have 30 days to wait. If Greer activates the emergency proxy and signs the closing documents on my behalf, she has to sign a legal warranty stating all internal bylaws have been satisfied. Elias explained, tapping his pen against the old paper. If she signs that warranty without giving the market cooperative their 30-day notice, the signature is not just invalid. It constitutes massive commercial fraud. She would be executing the transaction under false pretenses, and the liability does not fall back on the trust. I realized the full scope of the counter-trap crystallizing in my mind. If she acts as a rogue fiduciary, the indemnification clauses shift the burden entirely onto her. She and D&E would become personally liable to Briarpoint and the commercial lenders for the entire value of the breached contract. It was a beautiful, lethal paradox. Greer thought she was stealing a fortune, but she was actually about to sign a personal guarantee for a catastrophic financial default. We could file an emergency injunction right now, Elias suggested, his tone carefully neutral, testing my resolve. We could take Tesser's sworn statement, march into the courthouse when it opens, and block the conservatorship petition before Greer even files it. We could freeze the Briar Point sale indefinitely. I shook my head slowly, my eyes fixed on the archaic legal text. No, if we file an injunction, we show our hand. Greer will immediately retreat into the shadows. She will claim the fraudulent documents were merely preliminary drafts. Miles will instantly wipe the servers clean, deleting every trace of his cyber-stalking. They will play the victims, and I will be looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life, waiting for their next attack. I want them to commit the crime. I want them to lock themselves inside the burning building before they realize the exits are barred. Instead of a massive public legal strike, we opted for invisible surgical preparation. I instructed Elias to petition a quiet ex parte order from a trusted commercial judge. We did not ask to block the sale or the conservatorship. We solely requested a covert preservation order to lock down my digital signatures, restrict systemic access rights, and freeze the electronic audit trails across all trust platforms. It was a silent alarm that would not tip off the intruders. Simultaneously, I initiated my own shadow operation. Using the secure corporate channels of Gray Line Governance Group, I bypassed the compromised family networks entirely. I reached out to a fiercely independent, high-tier digital forensics agency located 3 states away. I hired them on an emergency retainer to establish a mirror of the Evans Row servers. Their sole directive was to silently record every single keystroke Miles Corbett made. When he inevitably tried to delete his fabricated behavioral logs and clean his tracks, my team would be capturing the deletion commands in real time, preserving the destruction of evidence as the ultimate proof of his guilt. While the digital net was being cast, Elias handled the groundwork. He arranged highly confidential encrypted conference calls with the leadership of the Evans Row Market Cooperative and the legal representatives of our 3 oldest tenants. He did not give them the sordid details of my sister's betrayal. He simply informed them that an aggressive unauthorized buyout attempt was imminent, bypassing their legal rights. He instructed them to immediately draft their formal objections and write a first refusal declarations. But his final instruction was absolute. They were to hold the paperwork in their briefcases. They were not to file a single page or make a single phone call until he gave the explicit signal. The final piece of the architecture was Tesser. My brave, terrified niece came back to my office later that morning. We sat in the quiet conference room, and she formally signed a devastatingly detailed, sworn affidavit. She legally attested to the backdated signatures, the intercepted emails, the fake brunch guest list, and the audio recordings of her mother plotting my institutionalization. When she put the pen down, her hands were shaking. I took the heavy document, slid it into a reinforced envelope, and locked it inside my personal wall safe. "You are completely insulated from this until the final second," I told her, making sure she understood the depth of my protection. "You will go back to your mother's house. You will pretend to be the obedient, silent daughter. You will not give them any reason to suspect you have turned against them. When the hammer finally falls, you will be standing safely behind my shield, with the trap fully armed, heavily camouflaged, and waiting in absolute silence." There was only one thing left for me to do. I had to become the perfect prey. By late Monday afternoon, the city was buzzing with the subtle toxic rumors Greer had so carefully planted. I knew she was watching my every move, waiting for a reaction. So I gave her exactly what she needed to see. I channeled all my afternoon meetings through a generic, poorly worded email. I left my office building through the main lobby, allowing myself to look disheveled, my posture slumped, my expression vacant and exhausted. I ignored 4 consecutive phone calls from my own executive assistant, knowing Miles was likely monitoring the communication logs and reporting my unresponsiveness straight to my sister. I drove back to my townhouse, parked haphazardly in the driveway, and shut all the heavy blackout curtains. I made myself look entirely defeated. I projected the image of a woman who was slowly buckling under the pressure, a woman who was seriously considering stepping back and laying down her responsibilities just to find some peace. It was the ultimate bait by playing dead. I gave Greer the overwhelming surge of confidence she desperately craved. The illusion of my surrender would make her reckless. It would compel her to accelerate her timeline, to bypass the final safety checks, and to sprint headlong toward the edge of the cliff. Absolutely convinced she was about to fly, I sat in the dark of my living room, sipping a cup of black coffee, and waited for my sister to trap herself in the consequences of her own choices. On Tuesday morning, the air in my life simply vanished. Greer activated the second phase of her assault, transforming a private familial betrayal into a highly public corporate execution. She convened an emergency session of the Evans Row Holdings Board of Directors. I chose to attend the meeting virtually from my kitchen island, keeping my camera off and my microphone muted. I sat in absolute sickening silence as my sister delivered a master class in psychological manipulation and corporate sabotage. She did not yell or make wild accusations. Instead, she performed the role of the devastated, loving sibling perfectly. She distributed the fabricated letters of concern for my neighbors and the manipulated therapy invoices. She played a heavily edited audio clip of me speaking during a high-stress construction crisis last winter, perfectly spliced to make me sound utterly unhinged, paranoid, and incapable of rational thought. Then she dropped the final weight on the table, the staged financial discrepancies, and the unauthorized corporate entity she had secretly created to mimic aggressive self-ding on my part. The board members were older, deeply conservative, and fundamentally terrified of any public scandal affecting their portfolios. They did not demand a thorough independent legal review. They did not pause to ask for my formal defense. Driven by a cowardly, desperate need to protect the corporate image at all costs, they voted overwhelmingly to place me on an immediate, indefinite administrative leave from all daily operations. The formal resolution stated it was merely pending a comprehensive review, but the sheer speed of the vote made it feel like a permanent burial. The suspension from my own company was only the first domino to fall. By noon, the suffocating pressure breached my personal life. I attempted to authorize a routine vendor payment from my private consulting firm, only to have my primary flexible spending account harshly declined. When I contacted the private banking tier, a deeply uncomfortable representative informed me that my accounts were temporarily frozen. They had received a severe internal warning regarding potential unauthorized transactions and erratic asset management. Greer had deliberately flagged the very corporate channels she and Miles had compromised, utilizing the bank's automated fraud protocols to make me look exactly like a desperate executive under active financial investigation. Just 2 hours later, my phone vibrated with a news alert. The city's most prominent society column had published its weekly digest. There was no explicit name in the text, but the blind item was devastatingly specific and utterly toxic. It spoke of a prominent local real estate undergoing a deeply tragic and difficult private period, urging the high society community to offer grace and distance during her severe mental health crisis. It was the exact sickeningly sweet narrative Greer had painstakingly seated for months. I was being buried alive in the court of public opinion, suffocated by the synthetic pity of people who did not even know me. With my operational authority officially suspended and my reputation heavily bleeding in the press, Briarpoint Development felt secure enough to move forward. They transferred the massive bulk of the hard cash required for the closing phase directly into the escrow accounts. It was an astronomical sum representing tens of millions of dollars, sitting just inches away from Greer's grasping hands. The mere presence of that money in the holding account acted like a potent, intoxicating drug on my sister and her husband. D&E was spotted at a luxury car dealership downtown that very afternoon, loudly discussing bespoke interior options for a vehicle that cost more than most people made in a decade. He was arrogantly spending the phantom weight of my inheritance before the contracts were even finalized. Greer, meanwhile, physically moved into my former corner office, issuing sweeping directives to the terrified staff and acting as the undisputed victorious matriarch of the Evans-Rowe empire. They needed me to surrender completely. They needed me to break under the sheer oppressive weight of their coordinated assault, so they could legally justify the emergency proxy. So I gave them exactly what they demanded. When Greer's legal counsel sent a formal, aggressive demand that I submit to an independent, neutral medical evaluation to determine my ongoing competency, they fully expected a massive, fiery legal injunction in return. Instead, I drafted a single exhausted sentence. I agreed to the evaluation without a single condition. I did not go to the media to scream about my innocence. I did not call the cowardly board members to beg for my position back. I stayed securely inside my townhouse, with the heavy blackout curtains drawn tight to the outside world, and more importantly to my sister. I was a defeated, broken woman who had finally accepted her tragic reality. The illusion of my total capitulation made Greer aggressively, dangerously arrogant. She pushed the final closing date with Briarpoint up to Friday morning, utterly convinced there was absolutely nothing left standing in her way. But behind the locked doors of my dark house, the air was practically vibrating with lethal focused energy. I was entirely cornered in the light. But in the shadows, Elias was moving like an invisible assassin, dismantling their entire infrastructure piece by piece. Elias tracked down the mobile notary public who had been waiting at the Sunday brunch ambush. Under the intense, terrifying threat of losing his state license and facing severe felony conspiracy charges, the man completely folded. He signed a sworn, legally binding statement confirming he was specifically hired by Greer with the explicit promise of a massive financial bonus to execute a hostile forced signature while intentionally denying me access to my own legal counsel. Next, Elias quietly subpoenaed the financial records of the boutique media consulting firm Greer had employed. He successfully secured the raw itemized invoices, proving my sister had paid an exorbitant premium to plant the blind item in the society column, officially legally linking her directly to the coordinated defamation campaign. The most crucial piece of leverage came from the commercial bank representative. Elias discovered the representative had only agreed to attend the Sunday ambush because Greer had explicitly lied to him, claiming I had already given my enthusiastic preliminary consent to the Briarpoint sale and merely needed to formalize the paperwork. When Elias quietly informed the bank's general counsel about the massive orchestrated fraud taking place, the bank secretly drafted an immediate withdrawal of their lending commitment, holding the devastating document in reserve for our final strike. The suffocating bitter pressure of the week culminated late Thursday night. I was sitting at my kitchen island, staring blankly at the marble surface when my secure encrypted phone lit up. It was a direct high-priority alert from the independent digital forensics team I had secretly retained. My heart hammered a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs as I opened the secure portal. Miles Corbett, brimming with the exact same reckless overconfidence that had infected Greer, was finally making his move to permanently cover their tracks. Believing I was completely neutralized and the multi-million-dollar deal was merely hours away from closing, he logged securely into the administrative backend of my cloud storage. He was attempting to permanently delete the hidden folder containing the vast, undeniable history of his malicious digital edits, the altered calendar invites, the spoofed internal emails, and the terrifying behavioral surveillance logs he had compiled from my own home security cameras. He truly thought he was wiping the hard drive clean. He believed he was erasing the only digital proof of his federal crimes forever. A cold, deeply satisfying shiver ran violently down my spine. Miles did not know that my forensic team had established a complete invisible mirror of the entire server days ago. As I watched the live technical feed on my screen, I saw every single keystroke he made. The forensic software was not just passively watching him. It was meticulously recording, timestamping, and archiving his entire deletion process in real time. He was not destroying the evidence. He was actively, undeniably documenting his own desperate, criminal attempt to destroy evidence. They thought they had won. They thought they had backed me into a dark corner where I would quietly fade away and let them steal my life. But as I watched the deletion progress bar complete on the screen, I knew the absolute truth. They had not backed me into a corner. They had blindly walked right into the center of the cage I built for them. And they had just handed me the key to lock the door. Friday morning arrived with the heavy, suffocating stillness that always precedes a devastating storm. The final closing for the sale of the Evans Row legacy was set for 10:00 in the morning. The venue was exactly what I expected from a corporate predator like Briarpoint Development. They had booked a highly secure private executive boardroom inside the Ashbourne Hotel, a legendary, notoriously discreet establishment located in the heart of the financial district. They specifically chose this location to ensure the transaction remained buried deep behind thick velvet ropes and soundproof doors. They wanted the contract signed, the money irrevocably transferred, and the champagne poured long before any local preservationists, angry tenants, or municipal city council members even realized our family heritage was being actively dismantled and sold for scraps. I was standing in the center of my home office, watching the gray dawn slowly break over the city skyline. Elias was sitting behind my heavy mahogany desk, meticulously organizing the contents of our massive counteroffensive into sleek black leather portfolios. There was absolutely no frantic energy left in the room. The blinding panic and the chaotic scrambling of the previous days had completely solidified into cold, unbreakable steel. Every single piece on the board had finally been moved to its exact designated square. The trap was perfectly armed. Elias handed me the final critical intelligence report regarding my sister's rapidly collapsing financial timeline. He had successfully utilized his vast network to track the pre-authorized wire instructions Greer had submitted to the commercial escrow officer the night before. The sheer level of her desperation was finally quantified on paper. She was not merely acting out of long-term greed. She was completely out of time. She had made binding, legally irrevocable promises to her most aggressive private creditors, swearing to use the real estate settlement funds to clear two massive, severely penalized personal loan commitments by exactly 5:00 this afternoon. If those thick hotel boardroom doors opened and she did not have that wired cash immediately available, her entire affluent lifestyle, her home, and her husband's remaining business ventures would completely implode into bankruptcy before the sun went down. The invisible tension holding her together right now must be physically agonizing. I looked down at the primary black portfolio resting on the edge of the desk. This was the definitive kill shot. The independent digital forensics team had delivered their final certified legal report shortly after midnight. They did not simply catch Miles attempting to delete the malicious files from my cloud storage. They had successfully penetrated the deepest layers of the document version history. The recovered digital timestamps told a story of absolute, premeditated malice that would make any judge sick to their stomach. The so-called behavioral instability dossier, the exact collection of documents Greer had confidently used to convince the corporate board that I was rapidly losing my mind, was initially created and formatted over 6 weeks ago. They had meticulously written the tragic narrative of my mental collapse weeks before the supposedly erratic events they cited even took place. They had drafted the final guilty verdict long before they ever invented the crime. Right next to the forensic report lay the sworn, legally binding testimony of the mobile notary public. Elias had relentlessly pressed the man until he realized his own professional license and personal freedom were directly on the line. The resulting document was absolutely devastating. The notary formally admitted under the severe threat of federal perjury charges that Greer had explicitly promised him a massive off-the-books cash bonus to facilitate a rushed, highly sensitive internal family transfer on a quiet Sunday morning. The explicit non-negotiable condition for his lucrative payout was to execute the legal signatures rapidly, specifically ensuring my personal attorney was intentionally kept entirely out of the room. But the most legally lethal document in the entire stack was a pristine copy of the commercial closing packet Greer fully intended to sign today. Elias tapped his index finger sharply against a specific dense indemnity clause buried deep within the lender agreement. To successfully secure the tens of millions of dollars from Briar Point's commercial bank, Greer, acting under the false authority of her fraudulent emergency proxy, had to sign a binding affidavit of corporate compliance. The clause explicitly guaranteed that all core commercial tenants and the historical market cooperative had been properly and legally served their mandatory 30-day notice of sale. It was a massive, verifiable, and catastrophic lie. Elias and I knew for an absolute fact that the cooperative had not received a single word of notice. By putting her pen to that specific page, Greer would be committing undeniable commercial bank fraud on a spectacular scale. She would instantly and irrevocably shift the entire financial liability of the failed multi-million-dollar transaction squarely onto her own personal shoulders. Finally, we added Tesser's finalized notarized affidavit to the very bottom of the heavy black portfolio, my brave niece's devastating first-hand account of the backdated documents, the fake guest list disguised as a loving family brunch, and the horrifying revelation of the private medical transport van booked to kidnap me to an isolated out-of-state facility. It was the ultimate emotional weapon, perfectly placed to ensure that when the financial structure finally collapsed today, there would be absolutely no moral high ground left anywhere for my sister to retreat to. Elias looked up at me, his hand hovering steadily over his mobile phone. "We could call the Ashbourne Hotel right now," he said, his voice perfectly level and devoid of emotion. "We could notify the Briarpoint corporate executives and their lending team before they even sit down to pour the morning coffee. We could shut the entire fraudulent transaction down before Greer even steps out of her car in the hotel lobby." I stared quietly at the leather portfolios. If we stopped her at the door, she would simply become a woman who tried to negotiate a bad deal. She would instantly retreat, claiming it was all a terrible misunderstanding born out of genuine familial concern. She would use the remaining power of the proxy to drain whatever accounts she could still access, and she would spend the next 5 years torturing me through endless, agonizing, and expensive litigation. She would constantly play the tragic victim for the rest of our lives. "No," I replied, my voice echoing through the quiet office with a frightening absolute calm. "We do not block the door. The most ruthless, the permanent way to end this war is to let her walk right into that room and sit down at that mahogany table. We let her smile at the buyers. We let her confidently pick up the expensive pen. We let her sign her name to the final fraudulent guarantees. I want her to legally bind herself to every single lie. I want the commercial lenders to officially verify the signatures. And then, only when she truly believes she has entirely won, we bring the entire concrete structure down directly on her head." Elias nodded slowly, a dark, profound understanding settling over his sharp features. He zipped the heavy black portfolios shut, the sharp metallic sound cutting through the quiet office like the drawing of a blade. I turned away from the desk and walked down the long hallway to my master bedroom to prepare myself for the execution. I completely bypassed the soft, comfortable sweaters and the neutral, accommodating colors I usually wore to family gatherings or board meetings. I was not dressing for a peaceful reconciliation. I reached into the back of my closet and pulled out a sharply tailored dark charcoal gray suit. The lines were immaculate, the fabric completely unforgiving. I slid my feet into sharp black leather stilettos. I pulled my hair back into a tight, severe knot at the base of my neck, deliberately stripping away any lingering trace of the soft, overwhelmed, and compliant younger sister Greer desperately needed me to be. I stood silently in front of the tall full-length mirror, staring deeply into my own reflection. For months I had carried the heavy, suffocating guilt of a fracturing family. I had questioned my own memory, my own professional competence, and my own fundamental sanity, all because I loved a sister who was actively poisoning my life. I looked at the hardened woman in the glass, and I saw someone completely and irreversibly forged by the fire of ultimate betrayal. I took one slow, incredibly deep breath, letting the freezing morning air fill my lungs completely. I was no longer the grieving daughter trying desperately to hold on to the fractured pieces of the past. I was the architect of their ruin. I was going to walk directly into that private boardroom at the Ashbourne Hotel, and I was going to force the traitor to sign her own name directly underneath the crushing weight of her own unforgivable sins. The heavy oak doors of the Ashbourne Hotel executive boardroom were practically soundproof, but they swung open with the smooth, silent weight of a vault. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly rich. Coffee steamed in porcelain cups. Sunlight hit the polished mahogany table. At the far end sat the legal team for Briarpoint Development, flanked by their commercial lenders. And sitting at the head of the table, holding an expensive silver fountain pen, was my sister. Greer was dressed in a pristine white blazer, the absolute picture of a composed, reluctant matriarch stepping in to save her family from tragedy. She was mid-sentence, explaining the tragic necessity of her emergency proxy. When my heels clicked against the marble threshold, the entire room froze. The Briarpoint executives looked confused. Danny, standing by the window, dropped his jaw. Greer stopped breathing, her hand hovering over the final signature line. I did not shout. I did not storm into the room. I walked in with the glacial absolute calm of an executioner who had already sharpened the blade, with Elias Ward matching my steady pace right beside me. Before anyone could utter a single word of protest, Elias unclasped his leather briefcase and began distributing thick black-bound portfolios directly onto the mahogany table. He placed one in front of the lead Briarpoint attorney, one in front of the commercial lending officer, and one precisely over the blank contract Greer was about to sign. "You are not authorized to be here." "Ora," Greer finally stammered, her perfectly manicured mask slipping to reveal the raw, desperate panic underneath. "You are on medical leave." "I am the sole managing trustee of Evans Row," I replied, my voice carrying the freezing resonant authority she had spent 6 months trying to steal. "And I am here to stop you all from participating in a massive coordinated commercial fraud." The lead Briar Point attorney bristled, sitting up straight. "Excuse me. We have been assured by Mrs. Holt that all internal proxy measures are completely legally sound. I advise you to open the portfolios," Elias instructed the table, his tone devoid of any professional courtesy. "What you are looking at is not a family dispute. It is a fully documented, digitally verified criminal conspiracy. I did not give Greer the space to cry or play the victim. I stripped the emotion out of the room completely, leaving nothing but cold, jagged facts. I looked directly at the buyers and recited the exact architecture of my sister's trap. I detailed the timestamps. I explained the version histories from the cloud servers. I pointed to the Internet Protocol addresses, proving that my own private devices were hacked from Greer's residential guest network. I instructed them to turn to page 4, where they found the high-resolution photograph of the Sunday brunch seating chart proving the so-called family reconciliation was actually a staged illegal tribunal. And then I played the audio. I placed Tesser's secondary phone on the center of the table and hit play. The entire boardroom listened in absolute horrified silence as Greer's own recorded voice echoed off the wood paneling, casually discussing how she planned to lock me in an out-of-state psychiatric facility just long enough to drain my personal credit lines and sell the property out from under me. The NE turned the color of ash. Greer shrank back into her leather chair, her pristine white blazer suddenly looking like a straitjacket. But the Briar Point attorneys were corporate predators. They only cared about liability. Their lead counsel looked at me, his eyes narrowing. "This is a horrific family matter, Miss Evans. But it does not invalidate our purchase agreement. Your sister currently holds the emergency proxy sanctioned by your own corporate board." Elias smiled. It was not a warm expression. He pulled a secondary stack of papers from his coat. 10 minutes before we walked into this room, the Evans Row Historical Market Cooperative and our 3 oldest commercial tenants formally filed their mandatory 30-day right of refusal and objection notices with the city clerk. The Briar Point lending officer gasped. He immediately flipped through the closing documents Greer had provided. "She just swore to us in writing that all tenant notifications were properly executed and cleared. If she signs that warranty today," Elias explained smoothly, "she commits actionable bank fraud. And because she is acting outside the legal scope of her fiduciary duty, the trust indemnification vanishes. She and her husband become personally financially liable for your entire lost investment." The Briar Point executives physically pushed their chairs away from the table. The deal was suddenly highly radioactive. But I was not finished. I turned my attention entirely to Greer. The look of absolute terror in her eyes was finally real. I delivered the deepest, most fatal legal strike of the morning. "You forgot to read the original foundational charter our parents wrote." "Greer," I said softly, "Section 4, Paragraph 2, the anti-inheritance fraud provision. Because you deliberately submitted fabricated medical evidence and manufactured witness statements to steal the proxy, you have automatically triggered your own expulsion. As of this exact moment, you are permanently stripped of all discretionary distributions from the family trust. You have absolutely no financial standing, no proxy authority, and no inheritance left." The collapse was instantaneous and spectacular. The Briar Point legal team stood up, sweeping their papers into their briefcases. Their lead attorney looked at Greer with pure disgust, formally announcing the immediate withdrawal of their lending commitment and the termination of the purchase agreement. The NE grabbed his head, realizing that the massive personal guarantees they had signed with their private creditors were about to snap back and crush them. They were completely bankrupt. Elias handed one final document to Greer. It was a notice of civil liability transfer naming Miles Corbett. "We have the live forensic recording of him attempting to delete the server logs last night. His attempt to destroy the evidence is now his signed confession. He will lose his cybersecurity firm, his federal clearance, and quite likely his freedom. The boardroom emptied rapidly, leaving only my sister, her husband, Elias, and me. Greer looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. She tried to reach across the table, trying to summon the ghost of the loving older sister she had murdered. "Order, please," she sobbed, her voice trembling. "You have to understand. I was terrified for you. I was only trying to save you from the pressure." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, just the clean, empty space where my sister used to be. "Do not ever lie to me again," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. "You were not trying to save me. You were trying to save your own life by selling mine." I turned my back on her and walked out of the Ashbourne Hotel, stepping into the bright freezing sunlight of the city. The aftermath was swift and entirely merciless. Without the Briar Point money, Greer and Deane's financial house of cards disintegrated by Friday afternoon. Their creditors seized their assets. The conservatorship petition was thrown out of court with extreme prejudice, and the cowardly corporate board immediately reinstated me with full operational authority, terrified of the massive lawsuits Elias was preparing to launch against them. The toxic web of fake concern Greer had spun across the city evaporated the moment the society columns caught wind of the fraud investigation. I did not destroy Evans Row to get my revenge. I spent the next year restructuring it, transforming the Central Plaza into a hybrid heritage trust and community commercial model, permanently preserving the heart of what our parents had built. I kept the cooperative alive. I protected the legacy. My greatest victory was not watching my sister lose everything she owned. It was surviving the darkest betrayal imaginable and proving to myself that the most dangerous kind of greed is the one that believes it is perfectly disguised in the wardrobe of family love. They thought I was soft. They thought I would break. They learned that the truth is a weapon, and I am the one who knows exactly how to wield it. Thank you all so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts on this crazy journey. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me even more by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by as many people as possible. Thanks to all.